let's. Okay, now you see my screen shared, right? You see the title behind me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just to make sure. Okay, so what we're gonna do, we'll do this morning is we're gonna talk about what this is the fourth of a series on pre-state religious Zionist leaders. We're gonna be going now to sort of pre-state people that were pre-state and post-state. They were, I should say post-state, but in-state. We don't have a post-state, thank God. But
Yeah.
and we're gonna look at what we've done the first couple of classes. The first class we talked about the dispute between religious leaders pre-Zionism and then at the start of Zionism over Zionism, whether that was consistent with the Torah or not consistent with the Torah. In the second class, we looked at Zionist rabbis who were more pragmatic in their approach. But we call them pragmatic religious Zionist leaders. And then in the last class we looked at were Messianic Zionist leaders. And today we're going to try to find a middle ground and see if there is such a thing as a middle ground. But I always want to make sure that we start off by just reminding what the definition of Zionism is, because if you don't have that, then we get completely lost in the discussion. So just very simple. Again, there's no official definition of Zionism. The Zionists never defined what they stood for. And they did that. I think they did that. My theory is to keep it as a very open door policy that many people could feel comfortable with Zionism. It didn't always work, but it worked for the most part. But just four components to the total idea of Zionism, and that's that the Jewish people. That's component number one, that we're a people, not just a religion, that we have a rights as a nation, not just as individuals practicing a religion, but we have national rights. One of those national rights is the third component is that we have the right to self-determine our own future, what we do as a nation. Nobody can tell us where to be or what to do. And then that all takes place in our historic homeland, the land of Israel. So that idea, that is keeping that in mind as Zionism, that's what we're talking about. We discussed how in the first class, yes, that is the definition of Zionism, but Zionists, depending on who they were, took it much further than just these four components. If it was just these four components, the only dispute you'd have in the religious world is if now is the time or not, right? Whether or not we should be establishing the state. But once Zionists became sort of an ethos of secularism, which then like really just imbued itself into what Zionism is all about. And they looked at the Israeli army not as just solely a defense force, but also as a social vehicle for sort of create a melting pot of people from different cultures and different areas and regions around the world. So then it started having, a lot of people started having objections towards Zionism, especially religious leaders, because they looked at Zionism as a threat to their ability to keep people in the fold of religion. Because again, now had Zionism just stuck to these things, I don't think we'd have as many issues today. But people got a little carried away. So the question is, as this is what we're going to be dealing with, is there a middle ground between pragmatic and messianic Zionism? So let's just review what each of these are. Pragmatic Zionism, as led by Rabbi Reines and others, it was a Zionism that said, okay, look, we've got, again, this is religious Zionism, that we have a mitzvah in the Torah to live in Israel. We have a mitzvah in the Torah to settle the land of Israel. There are mitzvahs that we can only do in Eretz Yisrael, and that's where we should be as a nation. And therefore, if the world now is turning on its head and moving away from imperialism and moving away from creating empires and colonialism, and individual nations are being given the ability to create their own nations and their own homelands. So then let's take advantage of this. Let's jump on the bandwagon and say, hey, we also have our own land. We also want to have our own independence, and let's all move back to Israel so that we could fulfill all those mitzvahs that we just mentioned, and let's create a state that is ideal for the Torah. That was very much pragmatic Zionism. The problem, and because we're a smaller crowd, I can get into this a little more. The problem became for rabbis when the secular aspects of Zionism came about. When Theodor Herzl would walk into your synagogue in your shtetl and speak, and he wasn't wearing a kippah, and everybody knew that he wasn't religious. And Chaim Weitzman, who used to be religious, walked in, and you knew that Chaim Weitzman used to be religious, and now he's not religious anymore. So rabbis looked at this and said, how can I get on board with this? How can I kasher the pig? Right? That's how they were looking at this. And I think that's what got a lot of rabbis to come up and say, you know what? This is a groundbreaking moment in Jewish history. If we could take advantage of this, this isn't just a way of fulfilling mitzvos. This is a period of time of redemption. This is messianic. This is an era that has never occurred before. We've got to jump on board, just like Rabbi Akiva felt that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach and that he was going to lead the Jewish people against the Romans, defeat the Romans, and herald in a messianic era. That's what Zionism could be. And the idea and the fact that it's being brought along by secular Jews isn't a disadvantage. That's actually how Mashiach is supposed to happen. And they create all these Kabbalistic, messianic type of theories that really took hold of religious Zionism because it was so exciting. And this was an amazing moment for the Jewish people that okay, this isn't just a way of us finding a shelter, finding a place to flee, coming back to our land. But this is biblical. This is redemptive. This is going to take us to places we've never been before, and concepts we've never really heard about before. So this is incredible, and that's where Rav Kook comes along, and Rav Kook really starts talking in ways that rabbis have never talked before. I just a little. I have to admit my bias here. I'm much more in the camp of pragmatic Zionism than I am Messianic Zionism. So I'll tend to describe Messianic Zionism as novel and something that's never been heard before. While if the Talmud of Rav Kook was sitting here, I have no doubt they would say, no, this has a long history, and this was a moment that Rav Kook realized that everything that he had learned before was coming true. But now the question becomes, if you have these two camps of pragmatic Zionists, which you don't see so much anymore in the national religious camp. I was just given a book by my colleague by Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who was the Rosh Hashiva here in Ma'ale Adumim. And he said, I was reading this book, and this is going to speak to you. He was a pragmatic religious Zionist leader. He writes very critically of and I had no idea. I had no idea, and it's too bad he passed away a couple of years ago. I really regret not having gotten to know him. He was right up the highway from us, and he was a Zionist leader. He was the Rosh Hashiva of a Hezbollah yeshiva, and he speaks very critically and he says, how can I know if this is a messianic time or not? But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be creating a state and moving to Israel because of all the other advantages. So now the question is, if you're faced with these two camps that we have, the religious pragmatic Zionist camp and the religious messianic Zionist camp, do you have to pick a camp? I've always had trouble studying Rav Kook's works. It's very hard for me to understand them. And we have somebody in our community named Hanan Morrison who spends his life translating Rav Kook for people like me. But I can't, even that I can't understand. So I once had the opportunity to sit with I worked at Yeshiva Kotel for a year, and the Rosh Yeshiva Raviter is a Talmud of Tzvi Yehuda Kook. So I said, listen, I'm in Menahel in your yeshiva. You're a Talmud of Kook. I'm adding a clause into my contract here. You have to teach me Rav Kook because I've never been able to understand anything that they said. Anything I pull off the shelf, I can't understand. So he sat down day one in our chavrusa. He said, okay, we're in a new time, and we talked about this in the last class about how halacha changes in a time of Mashiach. And I simply said, I don't understand. I've never seen anything like this before. And he said, listen, you got to choose your camp. You can be in Rav Shach's camp or Rav Kook's camp. You have to choose. I didn't know anything about Rav Shach. I didn't know anything about Rav Kook. So I said, I don't know. I'm lost between the camps. So I asked a similar question here. Is there a middle ground? And what I'd like to suggest, I'm going to take two figures. One is going to be very, very obvious for Soloveitchik, and one is going to be less obvious. And I think that if I would say, the Chazon Ish is who I'm referring to, so the Chazon Ish was a pre-state Zionist religious leader, I think I'd be laughed out of every single room, including my own. And but I want to show how he understood and took a middle ground. And a very practical type of approach, even though he was definitely not a fan of the state of Israel and Zionism as the way it was being formed and during his lifetime. So, okay, so let's look at this. This is two paragraphs from a column that I wrote, and I wrote as follows: "So, belief in the state of Israel as a start of the redemption has become a litmus test of religious Zionism. It's not enough for a religious Jew to celebrate the state of Israel, serve in its army, and see God's hand in the state's formation. To be considered a religious Zionist, a religious Jew must believe the state is the harbinger of the Messianic era. Jews who don't believe that the state of Israel is the beginning of the redemption have their Zionism belief in God called into question by other religious Zionists." I think this is 100% true. Again, we're not talking about Haredi versus Dati Leumi here, national religious versus ultra Orthodox. We're talking about within the national religious camp. Right today, it's very rare to find somebody who can say, "I'm a full religious Zionist, but I'm not on board with this being a messianic era." I don't know if this is the first step to Mashiach. This Rabbi Rabinovich type of approach is very hard to find nowadays in the national religious camp. And and that question is that really I wouldn't use the word fair, but is that the way it should be? Maybe that's a good question. Can we find something else that we could look towards? So let's look at the Chazon Ish. Now, just understand, we do a little biography here of the Chazon Ish because when we talk about the Chazon Ish, generally people refer to him just within his halacha, because he was such a prolific author on halacha. But the Chazon Ish obviously a Gadol Yisrael. He was one of the halachic the authorities of the 20th century. Chazon Ish, just so you know, he used to write when he lived in Europe. He used to write anonymously in Torah journals, and he would always sign it off Haish, and nobody knew who he was. But then he moved to Israel. We moved to Bnei Brak when Bnei Brak was one street long. That street now is called Rehov Chazon Ish. Then it wasn't, obviously. And he moved to Bnei Brak, and there everybody understood who he was. And most of the questions of the Torah world while he was alive came to him. And so that was who he was. Now he loved Eretz Yisrael. Now this is a man who moved free. He didn't move to run away from the Holocaust. He moved way before I mean, not way before, but enough years, sufficient years before the Holocaust to know that he wasn't running away from something. He ran to Eretz Yisrael because he wanted to live in Eretz Yisrael, and he got along well, as did almost all the Gedolim back then. Got even from the anti-Zionist camp, got along well with the Zionist rabbis. We talked about how Rav Sonnenfeld from the Haredis got along very well with Rav Kook, and it's not like today where you're not going to find a Haredi like leader getting together with a leader from the national religious camp and them having conversation and visiting each other on Sukkot or something. Unfortunately, that does not happen anymore, but it used to, and they used to get along well. So that was the Chazon Ish. Now, what was the Chazon Ish's position on Israel and the state? Oops, sorry there. Okay, so these are some of the quotes in the Chazon Ish. The land of Israel is the place of the divine presence more than anywhere else. It's our obligation to live there and sanctify it with Torah. Now that's a big statement. You don't see that in the normative today's Haredi world. If I would show that, if you show this to somebody, from the Haredi world and give them four options of who to choose, and one of the options would be, let's say, I don't know, Rabbi Soloveitchik or a Zionist rabbi or Kook, they'd for sure pick the Rav Kook because you don't see people saying it's an obligation to live in Israel. So that's somebody who's saying, okay, listen, Torah world. You got to move here. Like, that's it. This is the place that you have to be. He said the state is not our redemption, but we must deal with it as reality. Our task is to ensure Torah survives within it. Now, that's a very pragmatic approach, as opposed to nowadays where, let's say the Haredi leader today is Rav Landau. And he's also in Bnei Brak. And Rav Landau recently came out because of the World Zionist Organization elections. So he came out and said that it's absolutely forbidden to have anything to do with this. He reversed the policy from only 4 years ago and said you can't have anything to do with this. The Chazon Ish is taking a much different approach. The Chazon Ish's approach is that no, we have to. Okay, this is not what we wanted. For sure, it's not how we would have done this, but it's a reality, and it's a reality. We have to deal with the reality, and we have to make the reality as best as possible for us. And he said, every Jew who lives in the Holy Land strengthens its holiness, regardless of how they arrived. That's a very pragmatic approach, right? To look at a secular Jew who's not keeping Torah mitzvos and to say, okay, look, they're also adding to the kedusha of the land. And by the way, if you go through Maamar Chazal, that's an obvious statement. It's an obvious statement saying that somebody that settles the land is doing something that is a mitzvah. So the same way, if you have a secular Jew lights Shabbat candles every Friday night, you're not going to say that their Shabbat candles aren't worth anything, or it's ruining Shabbos because they don't keep the other mitzvos. So therefore, somebody that moves to Israel that's secular is going to be ruining Eretz Yisrael because they don't keep the other. That's ridiculous. So that's the Chazon Ish's, again, very pragmatic approach. David Ben Gurion had a famous meeting with the Chazon Ish, where the David Ben Gurion wanted to set forth the principles with how the state was going to deal with ultra-Orthodox Jews. Back then, by the way, there were no like real national religious Jews. You didn't have to keep us through God crowd, right? There was no mitzvah yericho, Steve. So you had, you basically had Haredi Jews and you had secular Jews. So David Ben Gurion met with the Chazon Ish to discuss the army and how that was going to work, and everything else. And they had a very serious, heated debate and heated negotiations, but they came together to come up with deals, which nowadays a lot of people are not happy with Ben Gurion about, but definitely not the Chazon Ish. But they came up to a deal with has been the policy of Israel for almost 77 years now. So this is how Ben Gurion talked about the Chazon Ish. He said he didn't bless the state, but he didn't curse it either, right? He cared only for his people's souls. Now, again, that's how Ben Gurion walked out of the meeting, a secular man who understood religious Jews, but said, "Look, he didn't sit there and say I'm not having anything to do with this or the state is horrible." He just said, "Okay, let's figure out how to do this the best we can." The Chazon Ish saw Zionism as a distraction from true redemption, which comes only through Mashiach and the Torah, right? But at the same time, the Chazon Ish was not going to get on board and say that this is part of the messianic redemption, because that's only going to come through Torah. And this is not a Torah endeavor, right? This is an endeavor that's not built in Torah. So he did not buy into the fact that this is messianic. But I'm going to stop here. Any questions, statements, comments, arguments, things I'm getting wrong?
No, it's fascinating. Keep going.
Okay, and we will. Okay, so let's look at Rav Soloveitchik now. All right, now we tend to think we understand Rav Soloveitchik, but we've gotten so far away from his passing that unfortunately a lot of his legacy has been distorted by students who all have their own agendas. Right, every one of our Soloveitchik students has their own agendas. So right, so it's hard to know who he really was. I can't say that I know who he was. Obviously, I never studied by him. My first interaction with Rav Soloveitchik was my father took me to his funeral. So that was the first time I had heard of him from my teachers, but I didn't know who he was. So Soloveitchik was obviously the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, and thousands of Talmidim. Also the Rav of Boston, and he would commute from Boston to New York famously and give shiurim. But besides that, the Soloveitchik family to this day are some of the most ardent anti-Zionists out there. There's a big difference between the Soloveitchiks of America and the Soloveitchiks of Yerushalayim. The Yerushalayim Soloveitchiks, to their credit, are so anti-Zionist that they don't deal with the state. It's not like a lot of the quasi-anti-Zionists who are very happy to take funds from the state, and take welfare from the state and take everything from the state, and then refuse to have anything to do with the state and say that they're anti the state. The Soloveitchiks and Brisk in Yerushalayim refuse to have anything to do with the state. They won't take any money from the state. They don't take what's called bituach leumi. They won't have anything to do with it. For a while, they dealt only in dollars. They wouldn't use the shekel. Right, so they're fervently anti-Zionist. Now you talk about the black sheep of the family. That was Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Soloveitchik was brought up, anti-Zionist, and Chaim, his grandfather, who was the one that everybody looked to in the family as this is who we should be and this is who we should follow, and his opinions are the opinions, was a tremendous anti-Zionist. There was not an inch given to Zionism, felt that Zionism was horrible, felt that it was going to be the downfall of a lot of Judaism. So for Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, to come out and join Mizrahi and lead Mizrahi and then become the prototypical Zionist rabbi leader, considered to be for the position of chief rabbi of Israel. Yeah, so that was a very that was a I mean it's impossible to understand what it must have done to him as a person to make that break. Right? This is not a simple break where he's decided to daven at a different shul. Yeah, this is everything. And for years, his whole life, his old world would mock him and criticize him. And again, for acceptance in the Torah world is very important. So for him to take this approach and to be a Zionist leader was a very big move. Now the question is, when Rav Soloveitchik approaches Zionism, how does he approach it? Now, how does he jump into the Rav Kook camp and say, okay, let's this is the first step of Mashiach, and we get very excited about Mashiach, or does he take it as a more pragmatic approach? He was the head of Mizrahi. Mizrahi was started by Rav Reines. Rav Reines was the leader of the pragmatic Zionist camp, in my opinion at least, and then he started Mizrahi to get that message across. So, how did Rav Soloveitchik deal with the Torah's viewpoint on Zionism? Okay, so this is so now again, I just want to say one thing before I make this bigger and see some of his quotes. But there's a famous unfortunate. It's not so much in Israel, nobody really cares. But in America, the biggest litmus test, if you're a real Zionist, is if you sang Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, right? That is like the biggest thing, right? It's kind of, for me, living in Israel, and I'm going to sound somewhat snobbish and arrogant when I say this. It's comical for us living here in Israel to have people outside of Israel, judge themselves and their friends on whether they're saying Hallel on a day celebrating the founding of the state of Israel. It's really like and our Soloveitchik was against saying Hallel in the normative way. There's a famous incident that occurred at Yeshiva University where a student said Hallel with a bracha. Soloveitchik favored saying Hallel after Kaddish Tiskabel, before, right after Uval Tzion, in this different type of approach without a bracha. But that did not take away from Soloveitchik's Zionism at all, or his appreciation for the state of Israel. But he was a very honest broker when it came to the state of Israel. He called balls and strikes as they came down down the alley, and he made sure to criticize the state and Zionists and the people when he felt they were deserving criticism, and compliment when he felt that they needed complimenting and they deserve praise. Today, I can't even imagine the lines when I read. Again, I did not know Rami Soloveitchik. I can't say I'm an expert, but when I read some of the things that he wrote, and I imagine a rabbi in America saying them today, he would not have lasted. There's no way they would have fired him from every single shul that he had a job, no matter how great of a Torah scholar he was. There's no way he's gonna get away with some of this stuff. Here's one quote that you could see would lead to a board meeting, an executive board meeting immediately, and then a search committee the next week. What was our reaction to the beckoning of the voice of the beloved? To munificence, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that word, of his loving kindness and miracles. Do we get out of our beds and immediately open the door, or do we continue to rest like the lover in the story of the Songs of Songs? And were we too lazy to get out of our beds? Our Soloveitchik answered his own question with a harsh criticism of American Jewry. Let us admit our own faults and confess to our own derelictions. Among the Jews of America, Orthodox Jews bear the most blame for the slow pace of the conquest of the land through settlement. It was for us, the loyalists of Judaism, to heed the call of the beloved more acutely and to respond to it immediately with extraordinary effort. Right? This is from his famous drasha of Kol Dodi Dofek from Shir Hashirim, which we just read over Pesach. And Soloveitchik said, if we have this opportunity to come back to Eretz Yisrael, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu is knocking on the door and saying, "Listen, I brought back this wonderful land. Here's the opportunity." And he says, and how could we, the religious camp, How could we turn this opportunity away? This is insane. We've been praying for this for thousands of years. How could we do it? How could we not heed the call? And that, now, if I'd ask you what year this was written, right? So you'd say this has got to be 30, 40 years after the state, but maybe towards the end of his life, because he's so critical of, and it seems like such a wide expanse of time has passed. He said, "Look, we had this opportunity and we've blown it. So if how long do you give somebody with this opportunity?" And this is written in 1950s. So you're talking, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 1955, 1956. So he's only has 7 years of perspective on this. And he's looking at the American community after only 7 years and already judging them critically of the fact that they haven't all moved to Israel. And he says, how could we, the religious camp, now again, and so he's looking at this and saying, we're criticizing Zionism for not being religious enough. Right? It's too secular. So and we're being critical of it. But how can we be critical of it if we're not taking the steps necessary to ensure that it becomes the image that we want? And the only way that happens is if we vote with our feet. We've got to be there. So that you see is a very, very pragmatic approach and very, very in line with how the Chazon Ish is looking at things. Right? They're looking at things through the same lens. Here's the reality in front of us. The reality in front of us is that we have a state of Israel. We have the opportunity to go back to our land, and we're passing it up, right? So, and we have an opportunity to shape and form the state of Israel in the way that we want it formed. We could do this the way we want to do this. So if it doesn't turn out the way we want it, we only have ourselves to blame. We can't look at this thing and say now we have to shun it because I didn't because it's not the way I wanted it to be. But you could have made it the way you wanted it to be, but you wanted it to stay back in your home and you were too lazy to get out of bed. That's the criticism that he's like that. And the only difference that you see here between Rav Soloveitchik and the Chazon Ish is Rav Soloveitchik is understanding this as God's knock on the door. That this is God knocking on the door. Chazon Ish doesn't mention that this is part of some sort of providential moment, right? He looks at this as purely pragmatic. This is another occurrence in the world. Soloveitchik is looking at this as this is divine in nature. Now the question is, how divine was it? How much? How much was this of a divine? Now this is Soloveitchik after the Six-Day War. And he says it is impossible to omit mentioning the great events. However, it is not my task to enumerate the great events, or if you wish to say, the miracles, which transpired in the past several weeks. All I wish to say is that in my eyes, in my opinion, the greatest of all events and the most marvelous of all miracles in the coming out of our people from a 2 millennia old historical eclipse, complete historical obscurity, into the center of the universal historical arena. The burgeoning of our people from anonymity, from the 2 millennia old anonymity into the focus of public interest and curiosity. Basically, in the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people played no role in the historical arena. Revolutions transpired, worlds have been destroyed and rebuilt. Our people played no role. We lived in obscurity and anonymity, and now a great miracle happened that our people somehow emerged from the shadows, from the anonymity in which it lived for so long. And now, in the center of the universal stage of historical occurrence. Yes, the Lord has done great things for us. Willy-nilly, you will have to acknowledge, you will have to consent, concur with us that the Lord has done great things for us, and we are ready to perpetuate his great miracle and to rejoice in it for many years to come, and we shall celebrate. It's amazing, amazing. He's looking at the Six-Day War, and he's saying this is absolutely an incredible occurrence that this happened. How amazing is this? And we see God's hand throughout. But what he's not saying is, and now around the corner, we have no doubt is a messianic era. That is, if you remember, I mean, Steve, it will pardon you, but if anybody else watched this, part number 3. So we talked about Tzvi Yehuda Kook giving a speech a couple of weeks before the Six-Day War. He did not know the Six-Day War was coming. He had absolutely no idea. We talked about luck. He gave a great speech about how one day we will take over the rest of Eretz Yisrael. And when we do so, that will bring us even closer to Mashiach. It'll have to be, and then lo and behold, a couple weeks after he gives the speech in his yeshiva, the Israeli army wins the Six-Day War, and we have all these lands back. And now the entire Rav Kook community is just expecting that white donkey with Eliyahu to come and announce Mashiach at any moment, as Rav Tzvi Yehuda had said. So that Rav Soloveitchik doesn't go that far. Rav Soloveitchik isn't cutting himself short as the Chazon Ish did by not ascribing divine providence and theology to the state of Israel. But he's not going but he won't go as far as saying that this is a messianic era. And I think that Rav Soloveitchik and the Chazon Ish are these middle ground of religious Zionist leaders that saw it more than just pragmatic, but also less than Mashiach. So I think that would be a third camp that we would have. There's a great line from the Rambam that I think is important here. The Rambam wrote as follows. So the Rambam says that when we celebrate Purim, we do so to inform future generations of the truth of the Torah's promise. For what great nation is there that God so near it as the Lord your God at all times that we call upon him? 1 second, sorry, someone's coming in now. Okay, whether the founding of the state of Israel is the beginning of the redemption will remain a source of debate among religious Zionists. But God's answering the Jewish people's prayers to return to Eretz Yisrael, settle land, and govern it is undeniable. The countless times Israel and its people have survived wars has further demonstrated Zionism and the state of Israel's providential significance. Right? Obviously, the last part is not the Rambam. Okay, so the idea is that we're looking at the way of this third camp is understanding the state of Israel as a way of God's answering the Jewish people's prayers to be able to return back to Israel. We've been praying for 2,000 years to return back to Israel, and lo and behold, we've returned. Right? So this is a continuation of this idea that the way we have to look at our at ourselves and look at the state of being that we're in and see how great things have occurred and how amazing things are. That's something that we should not take lightly and shouldn't say that this is just happenstance. That's what's occurring here. So let's look at this is what I like to call this middle ground camp. I like to call it the optimistic religious Zionism. This is again I've coined this phrase. You never hear it by anybody else. I'm not sure it'll catch on ever, but this is definitely I think where a lot of people would feel comfortable between the two camps. And Zionism as a movement is designed to encourage and inspire the growth of the Jewish people. There shouldn't be a litmus test of any Zionist, and especially religious Zionist. The state of Israel is a wonderful blessing for the Jewish people and the world. The state of Israel should be appreciated and celebrated and should be used as a vehicle to unite the entire Jewish people. Halavai. Halavai. That's the state of Israel that I think is this middle camp where we look at this and say, we don't have to put all our money down on one camp. We don't have to say that whether Mashiach's going to come, Mashiach's not going to come. We don't have to say, because of the state. Obviously, we believe Mashiach's going to come. But we don't have to, we don't have to say one way or the other. But what we do have to look at and say, okay, we should be very optimistic about the state of about the state of Israel. We should be optimistic about the time period that we live in and recognize the privilege that we have to live in a time period that none of our ancestors literally did not dream of. It was just a fantasy. It was a fantasy. None of them put their heads down on their pillows and imagined what we have today. They didn't. They couldn't. It was beyond their belief. I frequently talk about how if I had, and I apologize if I choke up at this. I've never been able to say this without choking up. But if I was able to walk over to my grandfather in his bunk in Auschwitz and be able to whisper in his ear and tell him that his great grandkids would grow up in Israel, so he would look at you like you're crazy. Like, look at you. Look around us in Auschwitz. Look what's happening here. And you tell me that just a couple generations from now, so my descendants are gonna be growing up in Israel. That's impossible. It's impossible. In a Jewish state, no, it's impossible. Who could imagine such a turnaround in such a short amount of time? It's very hard for us a lot of times to see what we're in the middle of, right? And sometimes when the problem seems so large, we sometimes forget about how wonderfully blessed we are. But we live in a time period where it's impossible not to recognize the blessings that were given, especially when we juxtapose it versus our history and what the rest of our people have seen for the last couple of thousand years. So now the question is, what kind of religious Zionist are you? Right? So now you have all these different types of camps out there, and you have all these different types of thoughts. And again, I don't think you have to choose. But I think it gives us a perspective and an ability. Whenever you have categories, it helps us understand things much better. That's how I see things, and I think that's how the Greek philosophers and Chazal understood things through categorical analysis. And so here we have three different categories, and the ability to be able to recognize that the religious Zionist camp is very nuanced. With a lot of wisdom and a lot of thought that has been put into it over the last 100 plus years, 150 years now, where this dream of being able to come back to Eretz Yisrael was possible, and not so simple to be able to say, okay, this is I'm just a religious Zionist. That means I'm a Zionist and I happen to be religious. There's a lot more to it than just a coincidence of two different camps put together. So that's my series here. That's all I got. So if
Wonderful. I have a question from you. First of all, a statement that this is extremely enlightening, even for those of us for whom this material is more familiar. Your organization of it and presentation was lovely.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And I have a question. What do you think is driving the Messianic Zionism now? I mean, I'm of the age where I watched this develop after the Six-Day War. I saw that Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's philosophies were being embraced more and more. Why today do you think there's so much strength in the Messianic Zionist approach as
I'm going to
opposed to?
give you a very disappointing answer. I think it's just a numbers game. I don't think it's gotten more popular. I think there are more people. So I think it's just, I think that there's a lot more people in the Rav Cook camp than there used to be. Not that they've had converts, they just had children. Like it's not like they're coming from other places. It's just these people are having a lot of kids. Yeah, you look around my yeshuv, everyone's having kids. It's right and left. Everyone's having, these are very large families. And large families have to go somewhere, and we've got a housing shortage. So what ends up happening is they start taking over hilltops. And and then you ask them, "What in the world are you doing? You're living in a caravan on top of a hill without any electricity. Ah, this is what's going to bring Mashiach." So then you start hearing these things a lot more than you would hear it before, because before they would take over a place and create a city, like here where I live in Mitzvah. But today it's so I think it's just a numbers game. I think that's why I think you're seeing it. You're seeing the volume put out there a lot more, and also with social media these people are able to get their voices out where in the past, mainstream media would not give them the opportunity to voice their opinions. So you didn't hear it that much unless you walked into, Rav Kook's yeshiva. Otherwise, you wouldn't hear that opinion.
I see. I see. Okay.
Yeah. So again, it's disappointing because it's not a philosophical answer, but I think it's correct.
Just sheer numbers. So the boys that are coming out of the Hesder yeshivot of all types, are they generally by and large more of the more pragmatic Zionist, or is there strength in among them also for the more messianic?
So I'll tell you. So I want to make a correction on something you said. So just as a side point, I understand what you mean, but you should just know Hesder yeshivas in Israel are becoming less and less popular. And when I mean popular, I mean by populated. Let me explain why. Because you have the everybody that used to go to a Hesder yeshiva now splits off into either a mechina, which is like a 1 year type of program, or they go and they learn for like 8, 9 years before they go to the army. Just as a side point to know. But I think what you mean is the national religious type of yeshivas.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right, right. For instance, we have one here in Mitzvah Yericho. We have a very large, very well-known yeshiva. Happens to be not Hesder, but everybody goes to the army at some point in their lives. So I think that they're definitely coming out with a messianic vision. I think that it's very hard to find Rav Soloveitchik, Chazon Ish, and for sure not a Rav Reines. None of these people have even heard of Rav Reines. And I think that if I would get up in my shul, I just spoke in my shul Pesach. I think if I get up in my shul and speak and start talking like a Ravinus, I don't think I'd ever be given the pulpit again. I think it would be I'd be looked upon as a heretic to come along and say I'm not sure that this is really the first step to Mashiach. I don't think I would last too long in this town.
And then let me ask you one more question, which I know is incredibly loaded, and that is, I'm so despondent, and many of us, I think, share the feeling about the rift between the Haredi community and our community, and how the Haredi community appears to us to be completely disconnected from what's going on in Israel with regard to fighting Hamas and the other enemies, and is just like in La La Land. And I'm hearing from friends a real despondency and in some cases a real animosity that I hadn't heard before towards the Haredi community. So, is there any reason to believe that this rift can be bridged going forward?
So I think everything that you've described to in your question is definitely accurate. I think that that's a feeling it's getting worse and worse. At the same time, one thing I'll add in that's a little more optimistic is that you find it's not a lot and it's not a big movement and it's not worth getting too excited about. But there is a movement within the Haredi world of now going into the army, which was not before. There are a lot of Haredi guys waiting for that draft notice as their excuse to be able to step into a uniform and step into a more I don't want to call it normative because I don't know what that means, but more a lifestyle that's I don't know, reflective of the outside community that they're seeing every day. That being said, there's still a lot of people. I think in about 10, 15 years, I think the dam will break. Until that point, though, there's going to be a lot of pressure put on that dam. And the dam's going to fight back a lot more than you've ever seen before. So I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better. But I think at some point it will get better. I think a lot of people are looking at, and I think that's why it's getting so bad. It's getting bad because people are on their fourth round of reserve duty, and they're wondering why they have to serve again. When if just a couple thousand Haredi conscripts would solve this problem. And why are they missing so much? 41% of people on reserve duty have been fired from their jobs. So imagine, it's a horrific number, which I think should be only met
Wow.
with jail sentences from their CEOs. But so you look at that. It's not just the suffering from being away from your family. It's a complete lifestyle change, forgetting about PTSD and everything else. And then I don't know. I'm going to turn off the recording for this. Hold on.